Welcome to Bedtime, Sleepy Historian. Tonight, we journey through time to discover how ancient farmers accidentally got drunk, transforming grains into beer. From sacred monasteries to bustling taverns, colonial experiments, and modern craft brews, explore centuries of fermentation, accidental discoveries, and the enduring magic of beer that shaped human culture and celebration. Long before the word civilization was ever mumbled by a sleepy scribe, there were fields, not fields as we imagine them, fenced and furrowed, but seas of wild grass swaying beneath a softer sun. The people who wandered there were hunters first and farmers by accident, guided more by hunger than by foresight. They did not know chemistry, but they knew thirst. In the Fertile Crescent, the rivers of Tigris and Euphrates carried silt-like secrets. When the floods retreated, they left behind mud thick with life, tiny grains that clung to skin and baskets alike. People learned to gather them, to grind them, to bake them into crude cakes that were more sustaining than the roots of the forest. But sometimes they grew careless. They left a bowl of crushed barley in the corner of a hut, forgot it through a rainstorm, and found it days later, bubbling faintly, smelling oddly sweet. They tasted it, because hunger is curious, and warmth spread through their limbs like the returning of the sun after a storm. That warmth was the beginning of a long, intoxicating friendship between humanity and fermentation. But no one understood it yet. They simply called it the spirit of grain, a gift that made laughter rise more easily and the night fires burn a little brighter. Imagine those early farmers, their hands callous from grinding, their feet bare against the earth. They gathered in small circles, holding clay bowls of that mysterious liquid. The drink was cloudy, its taste uncertain, but it carried a hint of celebration, of something divine. They must have looked at each other, grinning in surprise, the same way a child smiles when thunder doesn't sound as scary as expected. What they didn't know was that in those bowls, wild yeast, floating invisibly in the warm air, had found the sugars of soaked grain and begun its quiet, bubbling feast. The yeast ate, exhaled, and in doing so, gave the drink its secret life, alcohol. No one called it that, of course. To them, it was a miracle. The earth had turned water and grain into joy. Evenings changed after that. There were more songs, perhaps louder ones. The lines between work and rest blurred, and the stars themselves seemed to spin just a little when they tilted their heads back. This was the earliest accident in a long chain of human mistakes that built civilization. For from this discovery came gatherings, rituals, offerings to the gods who, surely, must have blessed this strange transformation. A small puddle of forgotten barley water, fermenting in a corner, may have been more important to human history than any war, any invention of kings or priests. Because once people discovered that grain could bring pleasure, they began to plant more of it. Agriculture itself, some scholars whisper, might have been inspired not by the need for bread, but for beer. And so, in the soft hum of those ancient nights, as insects chirped and fire cracked, the first farmers drank, not knowing they were shaping the future. A future where villages would rise beside rivers, where jars would line the walls of cool clay houses, fermenting quietly in the shadows. Sometimes, the old women of the tribe said the bubbling liquid contained spirits. That word would cling to alcohol for thousands of years. The spirits made people brave, talkative, foolish, tender. The spirits could calm the grief of a bad harvest or loosen the tongue for songs that told of gods and heroes yet unborn. And so, they drank again. That was the beginning of agriculture, of ritual, of everything that followed, the slow taming of the wild, the storing of grain, the keeping of time by the ripening of fields. It all began because someone forgot a bowl. The wind outside their hut carried the scent of yeast and memory, and perhaps, just perhaps, a little laughter. The night was long, but warm, and the stars looked down on the first drunk farmers of humankind, who, swaying slightly, felt the earth itself spin a little more kindly beneath their feet. And so they sang. And the song lingered in the air like the sweetness of fermenting barley, marking the moment humanity first tasted its own curiosity. And that is where our next chapter begins. When the morning after came, and they wondered what exactly had happened to them the night before. The dawn after the first accidental fermentation was quiet. The air was cool, the fire burnt low, and the farmers stirred from their sleep with heavy heads and puzzled smiles. There was a faint buzzing in their skulls, a dryness in their mouths, and yet, a strange calm in their hearts. For the first time, perhaps, a group of humans woke not just from sleep, but from intoxication. Their heads throbbed slightly as they blinked against the morning light, and their memories shimmered like water disturbed by a pebble. They remembered laughter, too much of it. Someone had danced near the fire, someone else had tried to sing to the stars. The night was a blur of joy and confusion. And now, the soft regret of dawn. They sat around the embers, squinting into the pale sun, wondering what exactly had happened to them. The liquid they had shared the night before, was it food? Was it medicine? Or was it some strange trick of the gods, a test sent to humble them? No one knew. But curiosity, once awakened, is a hunger of its own. The eldest woman of the group, her hair bound with straw, dipped her fingers into the leftover bowl. It had a sour smell, still faintly sweet. She tasted it again, hesitantly, then smiled, a slow, knowing smile. Her voice was soft when she spoke, but it carried. "The grain has spirit," she murmured. "It remembers what we forget." The others stared at her, uncertain. But when she offered the bowl, a few reached for it. They sipped, and that same warmth returned, not as fierce as before, but gentle now, like the last light of a dying fire. And so, they drank again. Not to excess this time, but to understand. That was the morning humanity began its first experiment, long before scribes and scholars, long before the word science. They watched the grain water bubble, noted how warmth and time changed it. They noticed that it tasted different depending on whether the bowl was left in the sun or shade, near the fire or far. Somewhere in those experiments lay the earliest form of brewing. The farmers began to collect the best-tasting mixtures, to store them in hollowed gourds or clay jars sealed with leaves. They learned that fermentation needed patience, the same patience required to plant a seed and wait for the harvest. Both demanded trust in time. And so, the spirit of grain became a companion to the spirit of soil. By the following moon, it became a custom. At the end of each harvest, they would soak a portion of the grain, mix it with water, and leave it to bubble and breathe. It was a ritual, half celebration, half prayer. They called it by names now lost to history, names that might have meant the warm drink, or the river's gift. When they drank, they sang. When they sang, they remembered. And memory, shared around a fire, became tradition. The clay jars grew larger. The process more deliberate. Sometimes the bubbling would go too far, the drink would sour or turn to vinegar. Sometimes it would burst from its jar, a foaming rebellion. But when it was right, when the yeast had done its invisible work just so, the farmers felt joy ripple through the camp. It was the same every time. The laughter, the stories, the small miracles of words loosened and friendships deepened. And so, the elders began to wonder, if the spirit of grain could warm the body, could it also reach the gods? They poured some of it on the earth as offering, a golden trickle sinking into the soil. They watched it vanish, and the next day, rain came. Coincidence, perhaps, but no one in that camp doubted the connection. The idea took root, as all powerful ideas do. What pleased humans might please the gods too. And so, each time the harvest came, they gave thanks, not just with labor, but with drink. What began as an accident became a ritual. And rituals, once born, have a way of shaping entire civilizations. Soon, the bubbling jars were guarded carefully, passed from generation to generation. The technique refined, less luck, more knowing. The farmers had become brewers, though they didn't yet have a word for it. At night, they still gathered by the fire. The drink still burned faintly sweet on their tongues, and the stars seemed a little closer than before. The children would fall asleep to the sound of their parents' laughter, to the hum of stories about rivers that granted blessings, fields that whispered secrets, and spirits that lived in the grain. And when the last fire died down, they would sleep, heads heavy, hearts light. The morning after no longer brought confusion. It brought tradition. They had learned, in their own quiet way, that joy, too, could be cultivated, just like wheat, or barley, or hope. And that lesson, once learned, would travel far, across deserts, across empires, through the tongues of priests and poets alike. Because by the time the first cities rose, humanity's oldest friend, fermentation, was already waiting in the shadows. And so, the story drifts from these nameless farmers to the dawn of the first civilizations, where drink became not just a discovery, but a symbol, a bridge between people and gods. In the city of Uruk, where ziggurats climbed toward the sun and clay tablets first recorded the business of men, there was a goddess who loved the taste of barley more than any mortal. Her name was Nikasi, the brewer of heaven, the divine lady of bubbling jars. By the time she appeared in song, thousands of years had passed since the first farmer forgot that bowl of wet grain. What had begun as a humble accident had become a tradition so sacred that it demanded its own deity. And Nikasi, radiant and patient, was born from that devotion. The people of Mesopotamia sang to her each morning. They sang not to conquer, nor to pray for war, but to honor the craft of brewing. On clay tablets preserved through time, their hymn still survives. Nikasi, you are the one who waters the malt set on the ground. You are the one who soaks the malt in a jar, the noble dogs guard it. You are the one who bakes the bapper in the big oven, and then puts in order the piles of hulled grain. These were not just words of worship. They were recipes, the earliest instructions for making beer. Each line described a process, and each step was a prayer. The people of Uruk brewed their beer thick and nourishing, more like a porridge than a drink. They sipped it through long reed straws, filtering out the floating bits of grain. It filled the stomach as much as it lifted the spirit. Children, elders, laborers, all drank it, for water itself was often dangerous, crawling with unseen sicknesses that the gods seemed to ignore. But beer was safe, purified by fermentation and blessed by Ninkasi's hand. And so, the farmer's mistake had become civilization's salvation. Every household had a brewing pit, every feast began with a drink. Clay jars lined the courtyards, covered with woven lids. When the sun sank behind the ziggurats, the scent of barley and honey drifted through the city like incense. Neighbors traded sips, poets composed toasts, and priests offered golden cups to the temples. Beer was no longer just an indulgence. It was divine economy. It fueled workers, sweetened treaties, and softened grief. It made the unbearable sun of the plains a little easier to bear. But beneath the reverence lay something simpler, almost childlike, the same wonder the first farmers must have felt as they watched the grain bubble in their bowls. That same awe still lived in the hearts of the brewers. They believed that when a jar began to foam, it was Nikasi breathing inside it. When it went flat, she had simply gone to sleep. Priests told tales of how she brewed for the gods themselves, pouring beer for Enki, the god of wisdom, whose clever mind always seemed more generous after a drink or two. And so, offerings of beer were left not only to Nikasi, but to Enki and all who shared his thirst for creativity. In a way, the drink became a sacrament of intelligence, for under its influence, humans dared to dream. It loosened tongues, yes, but also ideas. philosophies, myths, and laughter, all fermented in its wake. Even scribes, those careful servants of ink and clay, recorded beer rations as part of daily wages. The tablets show that laborers, including builders of the city walls and ziggurats, were paid partly in beer, sometimes 2 to 3 liters a day. It wasn't indulgence, it was sustenance. Imagine the workers resting after long hours under the Mesopotamian sun, their hands dusty, their bodies sore. They sit in a circle, the jar passed between them, the thick drink cooling their throats. Their laughter rises, echoing against the baked brick walls of the city. That sound, half gratitude, half exhaustion, was as old as the grain itself. Even the rivers that birthed their civilization, the Tigris and Euphrates, were believed to carry traces of divine drink. When they flooded, people whispered that Nicasia was celebrating. In temples, beer became a sacred currency. It was poured on altars, offered at funerals, used in marriage ceremonies. In its haze, grief softened and joy multiplied. The clay tablets of Sumer tell of a time when kings would not begin their reign without sharing beer with their people. A ruler who did not drink was viewed with suspicion, as though he had offended the gods themselves. From the forgotten bowl of an ancient farmer to the silver cups of kings, beer had woven itself into every layer of human life. Yet even as it ascended to heaven, it remained earthy, humble, bubbling quietly in clay pots beside simple hearths. And when night came to Uruk, and the moon shimmered over the rooftops, the people would sit by their doors, cups in hand, watching the stars. Some said the stars themselves were drops of spilled beer from Ninkasi's cup, tiny, golden lights scattered across the sky. In that soft, amber glow, humanity had found not just intoxication, but connection, to earth, to God, and to one another. And as they sipped, the world itself seemed to slow, to hum with the rhythm of fermentation, the eternal breathing of yeast and spirit. That rhythm, gentle and steady, would soon travel beyond Mesopotamia, carried by traders and wanderers, across deserts and seas. It would find new homes in new lands, where farmers spoke different tongues but shared the same thirst for discovery. Because once humanity learned that grain could become joy, it was impossible to forget. Across the dunes and over the mountains, the knowledge of brewing traveled with caravans and clay jars. By the time it reached the Nile, Egypt was already dreaming of golden beer for its gods and its dead. The Egyptians called it henket, a word that rolled from the tongue like a sigh of contentment. It was the color of the desert at dusk and the texture of morning porridge. Thick, sweet, and alive with the memory of barley and dates. It wasn't merely a drink, it was life itself, brewed into liquid form. In the cities of Thebes and Memphis, beer was as common as bread. Every laborer, priest, and noble had his share. It was brewed in courtyards where women stirred great vats, steam rising into the Egyptian sun like offerings to Re himself. Children darted between the jars, chasing flies, and the air was rich with the smell of malt and honey. Beer was food and faith combined. The people believed it came from the gods directly, from Osiris, Lord of the Harvest, who had taught humankind the art of making both bread and beer. To drink it was to honor him. To spill it was to waste divine favor. Every morning, while the city still yawned awake, servants carried amphorae to the temples. Inside, priests whispered hymns to Hathor, the goddess of love, music, and appropriately enough, drunken joy. Her festivals were legendary. Once a year, the city would shimmer in celebration, the air filled with laughter and the scent of fresh brew. It was said that even the sun god Re, when weary of humankind's noise, was calmed by Hathor's beer. In one old story, he sends her to punish humanity for their disobedience. But as she prepares to destroy them, the gods pour beer dyed red to resemble blood. Hathor drinks it, grows drowsy, and forgets her wrath. Thus, the world is saved by a hangover. Egypt learned early what Mesopotamia had begun, that in drink there is not only joy, but peace, and perhaps even wisdom. But Egyptian beer was different. Where the Sumerians brewed with barley and honey, the Egyptians added dates, giving their brew a sweetness that mirrored the river's generosity. They discovered that fermentation thrived in the heat of their land, and that clay jars buried in sand could stay cool enough for the yeast to breathe. The workers who built the pyramids were not slaves, as myths often claim, but laborers paid partly in beer, thousands of jars per month, each one a token of nourishment and celebration. Archaeologists still find the fragments of those jars near the great monuments, their insides faintly stained with residue from the last drink poured 4,000 years ago. Imagine it, hundreds of men and women, the hum of work blending with laughter, the steady thud of stone on stone, and the soft clinking of clay vessels. When the day's heat faded, they would gather in groups, share their beer, and speak of gods and stars, of family and harvest. Beer was their bond, their comfort, their nightly reward for shaping eternity. Even the pharaohs drank it. In their tombs, jars of beer were buried beside them, so that in the afterlife, their thirst would never return. Hieroglyphs on the walls depict servants carrying trays of frothing cups to their lords, offering the drink of peace. And yet, for all its sacredness, there was humor too. At the festivals of Hathor, the goddess of joy, men and women drank until laughter overtook them. They danced by the Nile, singing that life was too brief to spend in perfect order. "Drink now," one old song says, "for tomorrow the crocodile may remember your name." Egypt's scribes even recorded medical uses for beer. It was prescribed as a tonic for digestion, for childbirth, for melancholy. Beer mixed with herbs, beer warmed for the elderly, beer poured upon wounds to cleanse. The line between healing and indulgence was, as always, comfortably blurred. But at night, when the torches flickered on the palace walls, even the priests, those solemn interpreters of eternity, took a sip. For though they served the gods, they too were human, and humans have always sought that gentle quiet between sobriety and dream. Under the same stars that shone on Sumer, Egypt's brewers perfected their golden craft. They found that the longer the barley rested, the deeper the flavor. They spoke to their jars as they stirred, as though coaxing life itself awake. "Breathe," they whispered. "Breathe for us." And the jars obeyed. As the centuries passed, Egypt became the beating heart of brewing in the ancient world. Traders came from Nubia, from Crete, from far-off Byblos, carrying amphories sealed with wax. And in return, Egypt sent its own sweet beer down the river and across the sea, liquid history in every drop. There was something eternal about it. The Nile would rise and fall, dynasties would crumble, but the bubbling of beer continued. Always steady, always patient, always human. And so, when we imagine the builders of pyramids, we must imagine not just sweat and stone, but laughter and cups raised beneath the stars. Because for the Egyptians, beer was not an escape from life, it was proof of it. And from those golden jars, the story would continue its long, wandering journey, following trade routes westward, to new lands where forests replaced deserts and gods took on wilder shapes. The spirit of grain would travel again, finding new tongues, new rituals, new accidents. Across the Mediterranean, sailors carried with them jars of Egyptian beer and stories of its divine power. When they reached the green lands of Europe, the old spirit of fermentation met wild honey, and from their union, mead was born. The forests of Europe were vast and mysterious, their trees like silent sentinels, their rivers singing to those who listened. People who dwelled there had long hunted, gathered, and whispered to the animals they relied upon. They had grains, yes, but more often their sweetness came from nature's wildest gift, honey. And honey, when mixed with water, fermented by accident just as barley once had, producing a drink that intoxicated and delighted. The first accidental mead was probably discovered when a beekeeper left honey stored in hollowed logs or clay pots too long, allowing wild yeast to breathe and feast. When tasted, it warmed the chest, lightened the tongue, and filled the night with laughter. Much like the forgotten barley in Mesopotamia or the first golden brew of Egypt, mead became both sustenance and celebration. In these European forests, mead took on new roles. It was a drink for gatherings, for rituals, for marriages, for honoring ancestors. Its sweetness was a balm against the chill of northern winds, and its golden hue mirrored the autumn sunlight, falling through amber leaves. Tribes began to cultivate grains alongside honey, experimenting with barley, oats, and rye, blending tradition with innovation. Mead was sometimes fortified with fruits, sometimes with herbs, each village's recipe slightly different, each brew carrying the whisper of its maker. And so, the drunken joy of humanity migrated northward. Sailors, traders, and wandering storytellers brought knowledge of fermentation across rivers and seas. They spoke of Nicasie, of Osiris, and of the first farmers who had laughed and danced unaware that their accident would echo through millennia. The Celtic peoples, in particular, embraced mead with reverence. Their feasts lasted days, and during these celebrations, mead flowed freely. It was said that the drink gave poets their visions, warriors their courage, and bards the wisdom to weave stories into songs that would last longer than any monument. In the long nights, beside flickering fires, tales of gods and spirits were told. Mead was the sacred companion, its warmth chasing away the darkness, its sweetness softening the edges of life's hardships. The people began to believe that the drink itself held memory, carrying the laughter of generations, the whispers of ancestors, the joy of forgotten fields. It wasn't just a beverage, it was a bridge between the mundane and the divine. In mead, humans tasted the same miracle that the first farmer had discovered millennia before, the transformation of humble ingredients into something alive, something that could lift the spirit. The forests, the rivers, the mountains, they became the classrooms of experimentation. Villagers noticed that fermentation varied with temperature, with season, with the tiniest shift in yeast. They learned to time the harvest of honey, the boiling of water, and the mixing of grain. They kept jars sealed in cool caves, teaching each new generation the secrets of patient observation. And, as always, accidents continued to guide their discoveries. Sometimes a batch would sour, sometimes it would overflow, spilling onto stone floors and leaving a sticky trail that animals and children found irresistible. But even mistakes were valuable. Each failure was a lesson, each surprise a story. Communities began to hold festivals in honor of mead, much like the Egyptians had celebrated Hathor or the Sumerians sung to Nicasie. Music, dance, and drink became inseparable. People recognized that joy, delicate, fleeting, needed ritual and care to flourish. And so, fermentation was woven into the fabric of social life. Across Europe, mead became intertwined with myth. Heroes were said to gain strength from its golden warmth. Witches, later whispered, brooded under full moons, binding magic with yeast. Poets composed songs where honeyed ale healed heartbreak and fueled courage. Even kings and queens demanded jars of mead in their halls, and commoners cherished it as a gift of the earth. Yet, despite its ceremonial role, mead remained deeply human. It reminded people of laughter shared under the stars, of cold mornings warmed by the cup, of hands sticky with sweet residue, and the simple joy of creation. By the time the first iron plows carved the fields of Europe, fermentation was no longer an accident. It was tradition, knowledge, culture, and joy, born from chance, nurtured by curiosity, and celebrated across continents. And so, from the accidental drunkenness of Mesopotamian farmers, to the golden beer of Egypt, to the honeyed mead of European forests, humanity had discovered one of its oldest companions, the spirit of grain and honey, ever patient, ever alive, ever capable of turning ordinary nights into memories that would last forever. The story of accidental intoxication was no longer merely about drunkenness. It was about curiosity, ritual, community, and the quiet wonder that emerges when humans notice what nature offers and dare to explore it. And as the travelers moved north, carrying jars of mead, clay tablets, and stories of gods, the art of brewing prepared to meet new climates, new crops, and new civilizations, each bringing its own twist to the eternal dance of yeast, sugar, and time. In the rolling hills of what would one day be Germany, the forest folk met barley in abundance. The mead of honey still flowed, but now, the spirit of fermentation embraced grains in greater quantities, giving rise to what we would one day call beer in its more familiar form. The forests were dense, green, and alive with the hum of insects and the rustle of deer. Streams gurgled over stones, and the air smelled of damp earth and moss. It was here, among these hills and valleys, that early farmers began cultivating barley with greater purpose, observing that certain grains, when soaked and left to bubble, produced a drink more robust and sustaining than honey alone. Beer in these lands was hearty and earthy, often dark with malted grains, and thick with the texture of crushed kernels. The process was slow. Grains were soaked, lightly roasted, and mixed with water in clay or wooden vessels. As the wild yeast went to work, the people watched, almost reverently, as frothy bubbles rose to the surface. They were witnessing the same magic that Mesopotamians and Egyptians had centuries before, but with their own twist, guided by the forests and climate of northern Europe. Villages formed around these brewing practices. The act of fermentation became communal. Women stirred the vats, children ran errands between houses, and elders monitored the jars for signs of successful bubbling. The air was rich with scent, roasted barley, wet earth, faint sweetness. It was at once domestic and sacred. Beer began to take on new roles. Unlike mead, which was often reserved for special celebrations, barley beer became part of daily sustenance. It provided hydration when rivers were unsafe, calories when grains were cooked into thin porridge, and warmth during long winter nights. Farmers learned to ration it carefully, storing jars in cool cellars or burying them in the earth, protecting their precious fermentations from summer heat or curious animals. And yet the drink retained its spirit. Even as it became routine, it brought the same laughter, the same mild intoxication, the same gentle alteration of the mind that the first farmer had felt millennia before. In the evenings, people would gather around hearths, sharing stories of the day's work while sipping the frothy liquid. The stories flowed as freely as the beer, sometimes factual, sometimes exaggerated, sometimes bordering on myth. Beer was now woven into the fabric of human life, labor, ritual, celebration. Harvest festivals featured enormous vats, decorated with garlands of leaves and flowers. Music accompanied the drinking, with flutes, drums, and the clapping of hands. Dances became more daring as the golden liquid worked its way through limbs, laughter echoing through the valleys. In these forests, accidental discoveries continued. Occasionally, a batch would ferment longer than intended, producing stronger alcohol. Sometimes, the mixture would sour. But the forest folk were patient and observant. They learned which barley strains were best, which waters produced the sweetest flavors, and which vessels kept the drink alive longer. Each failure and success became knowledge, passed orally from one generation to the next. Beer also became a social equalizer. While honey mead was still largely reserved for festivals or the wealthy, barley beer was accessible to most. It was not a luxury, it was sustenance, community, and joy in one frothy vessel. Even children, though given weaker brews, drank to warm themselves and taste the ritual of brewing, learning early the rhythms of human celebration. The forests themselves seemed to approve. Animals were drawn to the smell of malt. Birds chirped in the early morning as though celebrating the work of humans. Even the wind seemed to carry the scent of barley and yeast between villages, connecting communities across the hills. And yet, beer did more than sustain bodies. It trained minds. Farmers began keeping careful notes on their harvests, the qualities of their grains, the timing of the brew. Without realizing it, they were practicing early forms of science, observation, experimentation, and record-keeping, all driven by curiosity and the gentle coaxing of yeast. The result was a civilization increasingly comfortable with both patience and celebration, with routine and ritual. Work and play became entwined, the labor of fields mirrored by the labor of fermentation. And all of it traced back to that first forgotten bowl of barley, bubbling quietly in a distant corner of the Fertile Crescent. By the time these forest folk had refined their techniques, beer had become a central part of life, nourishment, culture, joy, and a bridge between generations. And as these European communities grew and interacted with neighboring tribes, the spirit of fermentation traveled onward, spreading not just recipes, but laughter, ritual, and the gentle art of human joy. Thus, the accidental drunkenness of ancient farmers had matured into a tradition so vital that it would carry the rhythm of humanity forward, through empires, migrations, and the centuries to come. Beyond the forests and hills, in the fertile valleys of the Rhine and Danube, brewing grew more sophisticated. Villages became towns, towns became cities, and beer evolved alongside the first European civilizations. In these river valleys, water was plentiful and clean, unlike the stagnant ponds that had sometimes plagued earlier settlements. Barley thrived in the rich alluvial soil, and the people soon recognized its potential not just as food, but as a medium for culture, celebration, and sustenance. Fermentation became a central part of village life, the rhythm of the bubbles marking the passing of days, months, and seasons. The process grew more deliberate. Brewers learned to roast their barley to different shades, producing darker or lighter brews. They experimented with cooling the fermenting liquid in underground cellars, shaping flavor and consistency. Sometimes they added herbs, juniper berries, meadowsweet, or wild hops, to stabilize the beer and enhance taste. Each variation reflected both the ingenuity of the brewer and the natural gifts of the valley. Communities flourished around brewing. The village brewery was often the heart of the settlement, its smoky fires visible at dusk, its frothy aroma drifting across fields. Villagers gathered there, not only to drink but to share news, stories, and wisdom. Brewing became a social glue, connecting laborers, farmers, merchants, and elders in shared ritual and daily routine. As towns grew into early cities, brewing began to intersect with governance and law. Leaders recognized the value of controlling beer production, not only as sustenance but as a source of social stability. Records were kept, rations distributed, and festivals regulated. Jars of beer were even used as currency in some places, exchanged for grain, livestock, or services. It was both practical and sacred, honoring the same ancient traditions that began with a forgotten bowl of barley. Beer was entwined with religion as well. Temples often maintained their own breweries, offering golden liquid to the gods as part of ritual and thanksgiving. Priests developed ceremonies around fermentation cycles, teaching that patience, observation, and care were virtues essential not only for brewing, but for life itself. Offerings of beer to deities mirrored the earliest Sumerian and Egyptian practices, but with uniquely European flavors and traditions. Accidents continued to shape the craft. A batch left too long might sour, a container buried too deep could ferment more slowly, producing a milder drink. Yet every error added knowledge. Over time, villages refined recipes, learned the properties of yeast, and developed methods to preserve their brews longer. Brewing became both an art and a science, practiced by those who observed carefully, tasted patiently, and recorded diligently. Beer fueled labor as much as celebration. Builders, farmers, and artisans relied on its calories and warmth, particularly during the long, cold winters. Drinking became a communal act, a daily ritual that reinforced social bonds and eased the burdens of toil. Even children were given weaker brews at harvest festivals, slowly learning the rhythms and responsibilities of adult life. The cultural impact of beer grew alongside architecture, agriculture, and trade. Merchants carried it along rivers and over mountains, introducing new flavors, grains, and techniques. Recipes evolved, influenced by climate, terrain, and local customs. Each valley, each town, developed its own signature style: rich, smoky Alesh in one region, lighter, frothier brews in another. And yet all shared a common lineage, a thread stretching back to Mesopotamia and the first drunken farmers. In these valleys, beer was also a teacher. Observing fermentation encouraged patience, attention to detail, and an understanding of cause and effect. It reminded humans that even the simplest ingredients, water, grain, and yeast, could produce something extraordinary if tended carefully. This knowledge shaped not only brewers, but the communities they served, fostering innovation, cooperation, and respect for nature's rhythms. Even in the quiet nights, beer held magic. As the rivers reflected moonlight, townsfolk would gather by the brewery fires, cups in hand, sharing stories that stretched back generations. They spoke of gods and heroes, of great floods, of harvests and festivals, of the accidental farmer who discovered the spirit in grain. In those moments, the past and present converged, and the rhythm of fermentation became a rhythm of human life itself. And so, the accidental drunkenness of a single farmer had rippled across centuries and continents, transforming simple barley into a cornerstone of civilization. The valleys of the Rhine and Danube had inherited that legacy, enriching it with their own innovation, culture, and reverence. From these early European cities, beer would spread even further, to Scandinavia, to the British Isles, and beyond, each region shaping it, yet all connected by the same invisible thread of yeast, water, and human curiosity. In Scandinavia, where winters were long and sunlight scarce, fermentation became a vital companion. The people of these northern lands adapted the old recipes, introducing wild grains, juniper, and winter rituals that would echo for generations. The forests and fjords were dense, mysterious, and often silent, save for the crackle of wind through pine needles or the distant howl of wolves. Life here demanded resourcefulness. Grain could be hard to grow, honey scarce in the depths of winter, and water sometimes locked in ice. Yet, the human desire for warmth, comfort, and celebration remained undiminished. Fermentation, with its quiet, transformative power, became essential. These northern brews were robust. Barley and oats were soaked and allowed to ferment in large wooden vats. Juniper berries, collected carefully from the forests, were added both for flavor and preservation. Occasionally, wild herbs were used, lending the beer medicinal properties, strengthening the body during harsh winters. And when honey was available, it was combined with grains to make rich meads, sometimes stronger and more intoxicating than any beverage before. Beer and mead were more than nourishment, they were a shield against the long nights. In winter, when the sun barely touched the horizon and the stars were cold and distant, communities gathered around fires with steaming cups of fermented drink. The warmth coursed through their bodies, bringing laughter, conversation, and a sense of closeness that defied the darkness outside. Fermentation became entwined with ritual. Seasonal festivals were centered around the brewing process. The first bubbling of jars marked the promise of spring, while the last sip before winter represented survival, gratitude, and memory. In these ceremonies, the liquid itself was a symbol, life captured in amber, patience rewarded, nature honored. The Scandinavian peoples believed that the spirits of the forests watched over their brews. Juniper, in particular, was thought to appease these invisible forces, protecting both the drink and the drinkers. To spill beer or mead without offering thanks was considered dangerous, an invitation for misfortune or illness. So careful ceremonies emerged. Jars were blessed before fermentation, and small offerings were poured onto the earth to honor unseen guardians. Winter labor demanded the strength that beer provided. Farmers, hunters, and blacksmiths relied on fermented drinks not only for calories but for warmth, courage, and endurance. It is said that some warriors marched into battle with small barrels of mead strapped to their sides, sustaining both body and spirit through cold and fatigue. Children, too, participated under the careful watch of elders. Weak meads were shared during festivals and celebrations, introducing them to communal rituals and the taste of culture, responsibility, and patience. Drinking was never purely indulgence. It was participation in a social and spiritual continuum stretching back to the first drunken farmers of Mesopotamia. The brewing process itself became a revered skill, passed orally from parent to child, village to village. Secrets of yeast, timing, and temperature were closely guarded, yet shared freely within trusted communities. Everyone understood that a successful batch meant survival, joy, and honor. A failed batch could mean disappointment, waste, or social embarrassment. Accidental drunkenness persisted, of course, even in the disciplined northern communities. A batch left too long could catch everyone by surprise. These moments were remembered and retold as stories, growing into myths about the first nights of hilarity, dance, and mischief, the same human response observed thousands of years earlier by the forgotten farmers who discovered fermentation. Over time, these northern practices influenced the broader European tradition. Techniques for adding flavor and preserving beer spread southward, just as barley strains and storage methods traveled north. The forests, rivers, and icy fjords became classrooms for fermentation experimentation, blending chance with necessity. And yet, for all the sophistication, the essence remained unchanged. Beer and mead were still life's companion, teaching humans patience, observation, and joy. They were reminders that even in the harshest conditions, a simple, bubbling bowl of grain and water could bring warmth, laughter, and community. By the time Scandinavia's early settlements began trading with neighboring regions, their brews carried stories of long nights, of frostbitten fingers, of forests alive with unseen spirits. They carried the wisdom of survival, the joy of community, and the magic of fermentation itself. The accidental drunkenness of a distant past now lived in these northern lands as both necessity and delight, shaping rituals, society, and the very rhythm of life in ways that would echo for centuries to come. And so, as the first northern towns began to flourish along rivers and coasts, the spirit of fermentation traveled onward, still alive, still bubbling, still teaching humans how to transform the ordinary into the extraordinary. In the British Isles, the tradition of brewing met lush green fields, rolling hills, and skies perpetually gray with clouds. Barley and oats thrived in the fertile soil, and the people, Celtic tribes, early settlers and farmers, began to weave beer and mead into law, feast, and folklore. It became more than sustenance. It became a symbol of connection to the land, the ancestors, and the divine. Here, beer was thick and hearty, often flavored with herbs like bog myrtle, heather, or even wild berries. Mead continued to flow, golden and fragrant, preserving the sweetness of summer long into winter months. Fermentation was both domestic and communal. Brewing was done in cottages and halls, in village squares and temple-like groves, connecting neighbors through shared labor and ritual. Beer was deeply embedded in daily life. Farmers drank it after long days in the fields, its warmth restoring energy. Workers relied on it during construction, milling, and harvesting, its nutrients sustaining them when bread alone was insufficient. The cup of beer was both food and pleasure, a reward and a necessary comfort against the damp, cold climate. And yet, it was also a legal tool. The earliest records show that beer was measured, taxed, and sometimes regulated by kings or local chieftains. Rations were distributed fairly during feasts, and disputes over jars or casks could lead to fines or restitution. Brewing was treated as a craft, and brewers as respected members of the community. Their skills shaped the economy, society, and even justice. Feasts were sacred occasions. Seasonal celebrations, harvest festivals, and weddings featured enormous quantities of beer and mead. Drinking was ritualized, cups passed clockwise, libations offered to gods and spirits, songs recited to honor ancestors. Folklore intertwined with consumption. Tales told of enchanted meads that granted wisdom, courage, or eloquence. Some believed that a well-brewed ale could connect humans to unseen spirits of the forests, rivers, and hills. Children learned early about fermentation, often by observation rather than direct consumption. They watched the process, tasting weaker brews at festive times, and absorbed both technical knowledge and cultural tradition. Brewing was education, ritual, and inheritance, ensuring that each generation carried forward both skill and reverence. Accidents continued to shape the craft. A batch left too long could become overpowering. Wild yeast could alter flavor unexpectedly. Casks could leak or burst. Yet these mishaps were embraced, retold as lessons, or woven into stories of divine mischief. The accidental drunkenness that began with forgotten bowls of barley now existed as a recurring motif in festivals and myths. Humans humbled and delighted by the unpredictable magic of fermentation. Beer also influenced governance. Town meetings, councils, and tribal gatherings often took place with beer at hand. Decisions were discussed over cups of ale, disputes mediated by shared drink, agreements cemented with toasts. In this way, fermentation shaped not only social and domestic life but political culture as well. In homes, beer and mead were daily companions. Clay and wooden vessels lined kitchens. Jars were carefully stored to ferment in cool corners. Recipes were guarded secrets passed down from parent to child. Brewing was both art and science, requiring attention to temperature, timing, and proportion. Observation and experimentation were as important as tradition, echoing the careful curiosity of the first accidental farmers. The British Isles also contributed to the lore surrounding alcohol. Songs, poems, and stories depicted heroes and fools alike, their deeds amplified or softened by beer and mead. Festivals were punctuated by music and storytelling, linking intoxication with imagination, memory, and communal identity. Drinking became an act of participation in cultural continuity, connecting every sip to a lineage of human discovery that stretched back millennia. Through centuries of migration, trade, and conquest, British brews spread abroad. Techniques and flavors were exchanged across Europe, mingling with Scandinavian, Germanic, and Celtic traditions. Yet, in every vessel, the echo of that first forgotten bowl remained, a reminder that fermentation began not in science, but in curiosity, patience, and accident. Even in quiet moments, beer was more than nourishment. It was culture, memory, celebration, and connection. Every sip linked the drinker to the fields, rivers, forests, and ancestors who had discovered, refined, and revered the magic of fermentation. Thus, the accidental drunkenness of ancient farmers found new expression in the British Isles, through law, feast, and folklore, and prepared the way for the next great chapter of human civilization, where brewing would become even more central to daily life and cultural identity. As the Middle Ages dawned, monasteries across Europe took up the mantle of brewing. Within stone walls and candlelit halls, monks perfected techniques, preserved recipes, and elevated beer to both nourishment and divine craft. These religious communities became guardians of fermentation, ensuring that knowledge of the magical, bubbling brew endured through times of war, famine, and social upheaval. Monastic brewing was meticulous. Every step, from selecting grains to boiling water, from managing yeast to storing casks, was performed with care and attention. Monks observed the fermentation with almost spiritual reverence, aware that patience and precision were as sacred as prayer. Brewing was not mere sustenance. It was a ritual, an act of devotion, a connection to God through the transformation of simple ingredients into life-sustaining liquid. The monasteries served multiple purposes. There were schools, hospitals, refuges for travelers, and centers of agriculture. Beer was woven into all these functions. Pilgrims arriving for aid were often offered ale, sick patients received weaker brews as nourishment, students in monastic schools drank for sustenance and strength during long hours of study. Beer was life, carefully measured and generously shared. Monks experimented tirelessly. They discovered that boiling grains before fermentation improved shelf life and taste. They learned to balance barley, wheat, and oats for optimal flavor. Herbs were added for stability and medicinal purposes. Each monastery developed its own signature brew, its own traditions, and its own secret recipes. Some monks even kept journals detailing the outcomes of different techniques, preserving centuries of accumulated wisdom. Accidental drunkenness, of course, remained part of the process. Even the most careful monk could sip too freely after tasting a strong batch, or misjudge the strength of a new brew. Yet these moments were embraced lightly, often recounted as humorous stories during communal meals, reinforcing the human dimension of the sacred craft. Beer in monasteries was more than food, it was spiritual sustenance. Monks offered prayers for successful fermentation, sang hymns while stirring vats, and sometimes even dedicated new batches to the Virgin Mary or local saints. Fermentation itself became a metaphor, patience, care, and divine timing producing transformation, reminding humans that unseen forces, be they yeast or God, could turn humble beginnings into miracles. The wealth of knowledge accumulated by monastic brewers shaped the trajectory of European beer. Towns and villages often relied on monasteries for high-quality ale, while monasteries themselves sold surplus beer to support charitable works. Brewing became both a spiritual and economic enterprise. The golden liquid circulated widely, carrying both sustenance and tradition. Feasts within monasteries celebrated beer as much as bread. Harvest festivals, saints' days, and special prayers were accompanied by sharing of freshly brewed ale. Even in silence, the monks honored the drink. Its bubbling, frothing, and warm aroma were reminders of nature's generosity and human diligence. Beer also served as a tool for preservation. Unlike water, which could harbor disease, beer was relatively safe, providing hydration for monks, pilgrims, and villagers alike. Its nutritional content sustained bodies during fasting periods and harsh winters, blending practicality with devotion. The monastic influence extended beyond brewing alone. By carefully recording techniques, experimenting with ingredients, and refining processes over generations, these religious communities became early centers of scientific observation. They combined faith with empirical knowledge, preserving the art of fermentation through centuries when oral tradition alone might have failed. Accidents, experiments, and innovations continued to shape the craft. A new strain of yeast, a different water source, or a slightly longer boil could change flavor, strength, and preservation. Monks were patient observers, blending curiosity with tradition, ensuring that every batch contributed to a living, evolving knowledge of beer. Thus, in these quiet stone halls, illuminated by candlelight and echoing with chants, humanity's ancient friend, fermented grain, was refined, celebrated, and sanctified. The accidental drunkenness of distant farmers had evolved into an organized, sacred craft. Every sip was both nourishment and devotion, every bubbling vat a reminder of centuries of human curiosity, ingenuity, and reverence. Monastic brewing became the foundation for future traditions, influencing taverns, villages, and cities across Europe. It was the bridge from ancient experimentation to modern appreciation, from divine ritual to social custom. And so, the story of fermentation continued, a golden thread linking the accidental discoveries of farmers, the rituals of ancient civilizations, and the disciplined devotion of medieval monks. Outside monastery walls, beer began to flow into towns and cities. Taverns, alehouses, and marketplaces emerged, blending sacred knowledge with secular life. The drink, once primarily divine and monastic, became a cornerstone of social culture, a vital thread connecting labor, celebration, commerce, and community. Medieval towns were bustling, noisy, and fragrant with a mixture of bread, smoke, livestock, and the aroma of brewing ale. Taverns lined cobbled streets, their wooden beams blackened with age and hearths glowing with heat. The clinking of clay mugs and wooden pints became a familiar sound, as merchants, laborers, and travelers gathered to drink, discuss, and celebrate. Alehouses served multiple purposes. They were inns for weary travelers, centers of local news, meeting points for guilds, and sometimes venues for dispute resolution. Beer provided sustenance for those whose work required energy, warmth for cold nights, and joy for celebrations. Patrons drank both for necessity and pleasure, often sharing stories, songs, and wisdom passed down through generations. The secularization of beer did not diminish its value, it enhanced it. While monasteries brewed with ritual precision, urban brewers innovated, experimenting with flavors, storage, and fermentation. Local grains, herbs, and sometimes imported ingredients were combined in ways that reflected regional tastes. Strength varied, from light table alesh consumed daily to robust, heady brews reserved for festivals. Guilds of brewers began to form, codifying standards, protecting secrets, and regulating the quality of beer. Apprentices learned the craft through hands-on training, observing and repeating centuries of accumulated knowledge. Techniques for yeast management, malt roasting, and barrel storage were refined and standardized, ensuring consistency across batches. Beer in towns became a form of currency in itself. Daily rations were often provided to laborers along with wages, sustaining workforces that built cathedrals, markets, and city walls. In marketplaces, ale was sold alongside bread, cheese, and livestock. Taverns became centers of economic activity, hubs where news, goods, and ideas flowed as freely as the ale. Festivals and public gatherings featured beer prominently. Harvest celebrations, saints' days, and royal proclamations were accompanied by the communal sharing of mugs and pints. Storytelling, music, and dance intertwined with drinking, creating a rhythm of life that blended work, culture, and recreation. The accidental drunkenness of past centuries was now ritualized in public, sanctioned by tradition, and woven into the social fabric. Beer also influenced law and order. Alehouses were sometimes the sites of disputes, celebrations, or minor riots, and authorities learned to monitor consumption, regulate licenses, and ensure fair trade. The relationship between alcohol and governance was delicate but important. Beer could unify communities as easily as it could inflame tempers. Education and science continued alongside tradition. Brewers experimented with water sources, temperatures, and herb combinations. Observation of yeast activity, though not yet understood scientifically, guided refinement of flavor and preservation. Each batch carried the lessons of past successes and failures, linking accidental discovery to intentional craft. Children were introduced carefully to the culture of brewing. Weaker Alesh at festivals and family gatherings allowed them to observe rituals, understand social rules, and participate in communal life. Through these experiences, knowledge and reverence for fermentation passed naturally from one generation to the next. Beer's secular rise did not erase its spiritual origins. In some towns, festivals retained prayers and offerings, blending Christian ritual with older, pagan practices. Mugs were sometimes blessed before communal drinking, ensuring that tradition and belief flowed alongside the golden liquid. The taverns themselves became centers of storytelling. Tales of heroic feats, mischief, love, and folly were shared over pints. Poets, minstrels, and travelers spread stories from village to village, linking disparate communities through shared narrative and shared drink. Beer became a medium of cultural continuity, transmitting history, values, and humor alongside sustenance. Thus, beer transitioned from sacred monastery halls to the bustling heart of medieval towns. It nourished bodies, enlivened spirits, and fostered connection, both locally and across the trade networks that carried recipes, grains, and techniques far and wide. From sacred beginnings to urban celebration, fermentation had proven itself adaptable, resilient, and vital to human civilization. And as trade expanded, ingredients like hops began to appear, introducing new flavors and techniques that would shape the beer of future generations. The accidental discovery that began in a farmer's bowl centuries before now flowed through marketplaces, taverns, and celebrations, reminding humans that joy, community, and innovation often arise from curiosity, patience, and a little bit of chance. With the introduction of hops in Central Europe, beer evolved in taste, preservation, and culture. Towns and cities adapted to these new techniques, producing stronger, more complex brews that would define European drinking traditions for centuries. Hops, small green cones harvested from climbing plants along rivers and valleys, were discovered to have preservative qualities. Brewers noticed that adding them to fermenting beer not only imparted bitterness, a contrast to sweet barley, but also extended shelf life, preventing spoilage and allowing ale to travel farther without turning sour. The discovery was accidental, likely observed when wild hops grew near grain stores or when experimentation with herbs occurred in taverns or monasteries. The addition of hops transformed brewing practices. Brewers learned to balance sweetness and bitterness, carefully timing when to add hops during boiling or fermentation. This created layers of flavor, complexity, and aroma previously unseen in European beer. Techniques spread through trade routes and guilds, reaching towns from the Rhine to the Danube, and eventually to Scandinavia and the British Isles. Urban alehouses embraced hopped beer eagerly. Longer preservation meant larger batches could be brewed and stored, supporting growing populations and expanding trade. Taverns offered multiple varieties, from lighter session alesh to potent, hop-forward brews suited for festive occasions. Patrons learned to distinguish subtle differences, developing palates attuned to aroma, color, and froth. The cultural impact of hopped beer was significant. As brews became stronger and more diverse, festivals expanded to showcase different flavors. Seasonal brews were crafted to celebrate harvests, solstices, and religious occasions. Each town or region developed signature styles, creating a sense of identity, pride, and connection to local land and climate. Guilds of brewers formalized procedures around hops. Apprentices learned not only traditional brewing methods but also techniques for cultivating, harvesting, and preserving hops. Manuals and records began to emerge, detailing timing, quantities, and flavor profiles. Brewing was becoming a science as much as an art, grounded in observation, experimentation, and centuries of accumulated knowledge. Accidental drunkenness, though still present, became more predictable. Stronger brews produced stronger effects, leading to celebrations that were both more festive and more carefully managed. Urban authorities recognized the need for regulation, limiting overconsumption, maintaining public order, and ensuring fair trade. Yet beer's role as a social lubricant remained vital. Markets, guild halls, and taverns thrived, sustained by the innovation of hops. Trade networks expanded alongside hopped beer. Merchants transported barrels along rivers, over mountain passes, and across the North Sea. Hops themselves became valuable commodities, cultivated with care and sometimes protected by law. Recipes spread through itinerant brewers, travelers, and guild members, creating a pan-European culture of brewing that retained local flavors while sharing collective knowledge. Beer's social function continued to deepen. It nourished workers, sustained travelers, and brought communities together. Festivals became more elaborate, incorporating music, dance, poetry, and storytelling. Songs celebrated the froth, aroma, and color of beer, while myths explained the power of hops as gifts from the gods of growth and harvest. Scientific understanding of fermentation remained limited, yet observation was rigorous. Brewers noted the effects of different water sources, grain blends, yeast activity, and hop timing. They recorded successes and failures in oral and written tradition, preserving lessons for future generations. Each batch became a dialogue between nature and human skill, a continuation of the experimentation begun thousands of years earlier by accidental farmers. In homes, beer transformed domestic life. Families brewed their own batches, experimenting with hops, herbs, and proportions. Recipes were guarded, shared only within trusted circles. Knowledge of brewing connected generations, linking grandparents to grandchildren through practice, observation, and taste. Even accidental mishaps, overhopping, overfermentation, or spillage, were embraced as lessons, woven into local folklore and family stories. Hopped beer also altered commerce and politics. Town councils negotiated trade agreements for quality hops, set pricing regulations, and used beer taxes to fund public works. Taverns and guilds influenced social and political life, offering spaces where ideas, alliances, and decisions were exchanged alongside mugs of frothy ale. Through all this, the essence of beer endured. From its accidental beginnings, through ancient rituals, monastic devotion, and urban expansion, beer retained its ability to connect humans to the land, each other, and the rhythms of life. The addition of hops was not merely a technical innovation, it was a cultural turning point, shaping flavor, commerce, and society. The accidental discovery of fermentation had matured into a complex, refined craft, blending tradition, innovation, and community. Hopped beer represented the evolution of centuries, patience, experimentation, ritual, and joy combined into a golden liquid that fueled life, celebration, and creativity across Europe. As European empires expanded, beer traveled with merchants, soldiers, and explorers. New regions adapted local grains, water, and herbs, creating distinct traditions in Belgium, the Low Countries, and beyond, shaping the diversity of European beer. In Belgium, monks continued to refine brewing techniques, experimenting with wild yeast strains unique to their abbeys. Sour Alesh, fruity lambics, and complex Trappist beers emerged, each reflecting centuries of monastic dedication. The rivers and fertile valleys supported barley and wheat, while herbs and spices, sometimes imported, added layers of flavor. Belgian brews became renowned for their balance of strength, aroma, and subtle complexity, offering a sensory experience as rich as the history behind them. The Low Countries, with their bustling port cities and trade networks, adapted beer for commerce and travel. Stronger, hop-infused brews allowed merchants to transport beer over long distances without spoilage. Coastal winds and fertile soils influenced the grain's character, while urban demand encouraged experimentation. Towns like Ghent, Bruges, and Antwerp became hubs of brewing innovation, producing beers that would inspire styles across Europe. As beer traveled, local ingredients shaped flavor. Rye, oats, and spelt replaced barley in some regions, while honey, juniper, and wild herbs added nuance. Water chemistry, often overlooked in earlier centuries, emerged as a subtle but vital factor. Brewers recognized that rivers and springs carried unique mineral compositions, altering taste and fermentation. These observations, though empirical, laid the groundwork for a more scientific approach to brewing. The social role of beer evolved alongside geography. In port towns, sailors and dock workers relied on beer as sustenance during long voyages. Taverns became meeting places for merchants negotiating trade routes, soldiers planning campaigns, and artisans exchanging ideas. Beer bridged social classes, providing a common ground where labor, commerce, and celebration intersected. Accidental discoveries remained part of the process. A batch left in a humid cellar could develop unexpected sour notes. Wild yeast from the surrounding environment could create unique flavors. These mistakes were embraced, analyzed, and often intentionally reproduced, giving birth to new styles and regional specialties. The human response, curiosity, experimentation, and storytelling continued to shape brewing culture as it had for millennia. Beer's economic importance grew. Trade routes carried not only barrels but also brewing knowledge. Guilds in Flanders, Brabant, and Holland codified techniques, protected recipes, and regulated quality. Brewers became influential members of society, their craft linked to both sustenance and prosperity. Taxes on beer funded municipal projects, roads, and city walls, highlighting its centrality to public life. Cultural exchange flourished. Sailors brought Belgian lambics to northern ports. Dutch traders introduced hopped Alesh to England. Soldiers returning from campaigns shared recipes discovered abroad. Beer became a living record of human movement, adaptation, and ingenuity, a golden thread connecting distant towns and regions. In festivals, regional variations were celebrated. Belgian Trappist beers were toasted alongside Flemish Alesh. Spiced beers accompanied harvest rituals. Strong winter brews were shared during solstices. Beer was a medium for storytelling, song, and memory. Each sip carried the flavor of land, climate, and human history. Domestic brewing remained central. Families adapted regional methods to local conditions, experimenting with grains, water, and fermentation timing. Knowledge was preserved orally and through manuscripts, ensuring continuity even as towns and borders changed. Children observed, assisted, and learned, linking generations through taste, practice, and ritual. Beer also shaped social identity. Flemish, Belgian, Dutch, and other regional communities took pride in local flavors, recipes, and brewing techniques. Competitions, fairs, and guild gatherings reinforced these distinctions, while trade spread ideas that allowed innovation without erasing tradition. In this way, beer became both unifying and distinguishing, a reflection of shared human ingenuity and local character. Thus, as European empires expanded, beer moved with them, adapting, evolving, and enriching culture. From monastic halls to bustling port cities, from local festivals to trade networks, fermentation carried centuries of accumulated wisdom, joy, and community. The accidental drunkenness of ancient farmers had transformed into a sophisticated, celebrated, and diverse European tradition. And as explorers sailed beyond the continent, beer's journey was far from over, preparing to meet new lands, cultures, and climates that would challenge, transform, and expand its legacy yet again. Across the Atlantic, European settlers carried barley, yeast, and brewing knowledge to the New World. The early colonies faced unfamiliar climates, native grains, and limited supplies, prompting experimentation and adaptation. Brewing became both necessity and comfort, a link to home, a source of sustenance, and a tool for social cohesion in a new, unpredictable land. Settlers arriving along the eastern seaboard found fertile soil, but a different seasonal rhythm. Winters were harsh, summers humid, and native pests threatened crops. Traditional barley sometimes struggled to thrive, forcing settlers to experiment with oats, corn, and rye. These substitutions altered flavor, texture, and fermentation dynamics, producing beers distinct from their European ancestors. Water quality posed another challenge. Rivers and springs, often laden with minerals or bacteria, influenced taste and sometimes risked health. Brewing became a method of purification. Boiling water with grains and fermenting it with yeast rendered the drink safer than unprocessed water, sustaining communities during the early, uncertain years of settlement. Hops, introduced by settlers from Europe, were cultivated where possible, though often supplemented with native herbs. Juniper berries, spruce tips, and maple sap were experimented with, creating a uniquely American palette of flavors. These hybrid recipes reflected necessity and creativity, blending old-world tradition with new-world innovation. Beer became central to colonial life. In remote settlements, it provided calories and warmth during long, laborious days, whether planting crops, constructing homes, or hunting game. Taverns in emerging towns became community hubs, places for news, trade, socialization, and ritual. Even in sparsely populated areas, brewing was essential for maintaining morale and social cohesion. Accidental drunkenness remained part of the colonial experience. Strong brews were sometimes unintentionally produced, causing surprise and laughter among settlers after long days of work. Such occurrences were woven into local tales, providing both humor and caution about overindulgence. They also demonstrated the continuity of human behavior from ancient farmers to modern pioneers, curiosity and celebration intertwined. Beer also intersected with commerce and politics in the colonies. Taverns hosted town meetings, legal proceedings, and merchant negotiations. Beer rationing sometimes occurred during shortages, and small-scale brewing became an entrepreneurial opportunity. Breweries, whether in private homes or community halls, contributed to the economy and social fabric. Cultural adaptation flourished. Native peoples were sometimes introduced to European-style beer, while settlers observed indigenous fermentation practices, such as corn-based or honey-based drinks. This exchange led to hybrid beverages and techniques, further expanding the diversity of colonial brewing. Recipes evolved as experimentation continued, each batch influenced by climate, ingredients, and human ingenuity. Festivals and communal gatherings featured beer prominently. Harvest celebrations, religious observances, and social milestones relied on shared drinking to reinforce community bonds. Drinking was both celebration and ritual, maintaining continuity with European traditions while adapting to the new environment. Knowledge transfer was critical. Experienced brewers taught apprentices and neighbors, passing down methods, observations, and innovations. Journals and letters preserved information about successful strains, water sources, and seasonal timing, creating a colonial record of fermentation practice. Children observed the brewing process, learning practical and social lessons alongside their elders. By combining necessity, observation, and experimentation, settlers ensured that beer remained a reliable source of sustenance, social cohesion, and cultural continuity. Even in the New World, far from the valleys, forests, and monasteries of Europe, the spirit of accidental discovery, the bubbling, transformative magic of yeast, continued to shape human life. Thus, beer's journey from ancient accidental fermentation to colonial adaptation demonstrates its resilience, versatility, and centrality to human civilization. The accidental drunkenness of early farmers had evolved into a global tradition of experimentation, sustenance, and communal joy, ready to expand into future centuries of innovation and culture. By the 18th and 19th centuries, brewing underwent profound transformation. Mechanization, refrigeration, and scientific understanding changed beer from a localized, artisanal craft into a mass-produced staple. Yet, even amidst industry, the spirit of accidental discovery, experimentation, and communal joy persisted, linking modern brews to the ancient farmers who first noticed bubbles in their grain. The Industrial Revolution brought new tools and techniques to brewing. Steam engines powered mills, grinding barley more efficiently than ever before. Large-scale boiling vats and pressurized fermenters allowed consistent production at unprecedented volumes. Town breweries expanded into factories, with specialized staff managing every stage of production, from grain selection to yeast cultivation, to bottling and distribution. Scientific understanding began to catch up with tradition. Microbiologists like Louis Pasteur studied yeast and fermentation, revealing the underlying processes that had long been observed empirically by brewers. Pasteur's work explained why certain batches succeeded while others failed, allowing brewers to predict outcomes with greater accuracy and replicate flavors across larger volumes. Fermentation, once mysterious and accidental, became a controlled art and science. Refrigeration revolutionized beer further. Prior to cooling technology, brewers relied on cellars, caves, or winter temperatures to control fermentation. Refrigeration allowed year-round production, longer storage, and transport over greater distances. Lager beers, which require colder fermentation temperatures, became widely popular, bringing crisp, clean flavors to urban populations that had never experienced such consistency. Despite these advancements, beer remained a deeply human experience. Taverns, public houses, and family breweries continued to thrive alongside industrial production. Shared drinking, celebration, and ritual persisted. Even as alcohol became available in bottles from distant factories, the communal act of pouring, toasting, and storytelling endured. Accidental drunkenness still brought laughter, bonding, and human spontaneity. Global trade expanded the reach of beer. Ingredients, equipment, and techniques traveled across continents. Hops from Germany, barley from England, and yeast cultures from Belgium spread internationally. Colonial and industrial networks ensured that recipes evolved, blended, and adapted to local climates and tastes, producing a diverse world of beer unparalleled in history. Urbanization increased demand. Workers in factories, miners in shafts, and sailors in ports relied on beer not just for pleasure but as sustenance and social cohesion. Brewpubs became centers of cultural exchange, with music, conversation, and camaraderie flowing alongside frothy pints. Beer shaped daily rhythms, festivals, and labor practices. Industrialization also democratized brewing. Bottled beer and standardized Ales made it accessible to wider populations, transcending social class. Families could enjoy quality beverages at home, workers could gather in taverns, and communities could celebrate collectively. Yet the connection to ancient practices remained, the observation of bubbles, the patience of fermentation, and the delight of taste linked modern drinkers to the very first farmers who discovered the magic of grain and yeast. Innovation continued. Different strains of yeast, hops, and barley produced a diversity of flavors. Brewmasters experimented with dark stouts, pale Ales, and aromatic porters, crafting styles that reflected both regional preference and creative ambition. Industrial techniques allowed these styles to be reproduced reliably, preserving the essence of traditional recipes while accommodating modern production demands. Festivals, competitions, and cultural ceremonies incorporated industrial beers alongside traditional Ales. Knowledge of brewing became formalized in schools and societies, yet storytelling, folklore, and accidental misadventures were still celebrated, keeping the human element alive in an increasingly mechanized world. Beer's journey from prehistoric accidental fermentation to industrial precision illustrates resilience, adaptability, and enduring cultural importance. The accidental drunkenness of ancient farmers had evolved into a structured, sophisticated global tradition, but its social and emotional significance, the joy, celebration, and connection, remained unchanged. Through mechanization, refrigeration, and scientific insight, humanity had transformed beer into a reliable, cherished, and globally influential craft. And yet, in every sip, the centuries of curiosity, patience, observation, and joyful accident could still be tasted, a golden thread linking the dawn of agriculture to the industrial age. In the 20th century, beer confronted unprecedented challenges. Prohibition in the United States, world wars across continents, and shifting cultural values tested both the resilience of brewing and the human desire for communal drink. Yet, amid restriction, scarcity, and upheaval, creativity endured, and the centuries-old spirit of fermentation persisted. Prohibition, 1920 to 1933, in the United States disrupted centuries of brewing tradition. Bars closed, breweries were shuttered, and the legal sale of alcohol was banned. Yet human ingenuity persisted. Some brewers switched to non-alcoholic beverages like near beer, sodas, or malt extracts. Others operated clandestinely, producing and distributing beer in secret. The experience highlighted both the social importance of beer and the lengths humans would go to preserve it. Despite legal constraints, prohibition had lasting effects on brewing. Standardization became necessary, as mass-produced near beers and soft drinks required predictable consistency. Breweries that survived adapted to new regulations, paving the way for innovations in production, packaging, and distribution that would shape post-prohibition brewing. World Wars I and II imposed further challenges. Grain shortages, rationing, and damaged infrastructure threatened beer production across Europe. Yet soldiers, civilians, and brewers found ways to continue the craft. Military rations sometimes included beer or beer substitutes, sustaining morale and camaraderie. Breweries repurposed equipment, experimented with limited ingredients, and preserved traditional knowledge under duress. In occupied territories, beer also became a symbol of resistance, comfort, and identity. Taverns and local breweries maintained cultural traditions despite external pressures. Recipes were preserved secretly, handed down in writing or memory, ensuring that the spirit of fermentation would survive even the darkest periods. Cultural shifts also influenced beer consumption. The rise of temperance movements, changing work patterns, and urbanization altered drinking habits. Public houses adapted, offering lighter beers or more socially oriented spaces. Women increasingly participated in brewing and consumption, adding new perspectives and expanding the social context of beer. Industrialization and scientific advancements continued to shape brewing. Refrigeration, pasteurization, and automated bottling allowed large-scale production even under wartime constraints. Innovation ensured that beer could reach populations far from breweries, maintaining social cohesion and sustenance. Amid these challenges, beer festivals, competitions, and local traditions persisted. Communities celebrated harvests, victories, and cultural milestones, often using beer as a symbol of resilience and continuity. Folklore and storytelling remained vibrant, preserving humor, wisdom, and the collective memory of centuries of fermentation. Accidental drunkenness, though sometimes frowned upon in restrictive societies, continued to be part of human experience. It reminded drinkers of beer's ancient roots, the surprise, delight, and occasional folly that had defined its history since the first farmer noticed bubbles in grain. Even under strict laws, human connection to fermentation endured. Post-war reconstruction further emphasized beer's cultural importance. In Europe, breweries rebuilt, sometimes with innovative techniques, blending tradition with necessity. In the United States, the end of Prohibition sparked a revival, with breweries reclaiming pre-Prohibition recipes while experimenting with modern methods. Beer once again became a marker of community, identity, and celebration. Globalization in the 20th century extended beer's influence. Recipes, ingredients, and techniques spread internationally through trade, migration, and cultural exchange. European traditions mingled with American innovation, colonial legacies blended with local experimentation, and industrial techniques allowed for the creation of consistent, high-quality beers on a global scale. The 20th century demonstrated beer's adaptability. Despite legal bans, wars, and cultural shifts, brewing persisted through innovation, determination, and communal support. The accidental discoveries of ancient farmers had evolved into global industries, yet the essence, joy, experimentation, connection, and transformation remained intact. Beer endured as nourishment, celebration, and social glue. It survived adversity, expanded in diversity, and continued to inspire innovation. Even in modern times, each sip carries centuries of curiosity, patience, and accidental discovery, a link from the earliest farmers to contemporary drinkers. In the late 20th and early 21st centuries, the brewing world experienced a renaissance. The craft beer movement emerged, driven by small-scale breweries, passionate brewers, and consumers seeking diversity, flavor, and authenticity. This revival honored centuries of tradition while embracing creativity, experimentation, and community, linking the accidental beginnings of beer to the modern era. Craft brewers emphasized quality over quantity. Unlike industrial breweries, which prioritized consistency and mass production, craft brewers focused on taste, originality, and regional character. They experimented with traditional recipes passed down from European monasteries, towns, and colonial settlers, while also introducing innovative combinations, fruits, spices, barrels aged in whiskey or wine, and even unconventional grains like quinoa or sorghum. Small-scale brewing allowed for meticulous attention to detail. Every step, mashing, boiling, hopping, fermenting, and bottling, was carefully monitored. Brewers observed yeast behavior, water quality, and fermentation temperature with a combination of scientific understanding and artisanal intuition. The result was beer that celebrated both precision and unpredictability, echoing the ancient joy of accidental discovery. The craft beer movement also revived historical styles. Belgian lambics, English porters, German Hefeweizens, and Scandinavian meads found new life in modern interpretations. Consumers could taste centuries of brewing evolution, connecting with regional traditions and appreciating the depth of history in every glass. Festivals and tasting events became opportunities to educate, celebrate, and share stories, continuing the cultural role beer had played since ancient times. Accidental drunkenness remained part of the experience, though now in more controlled and celebratory contexts. Brew pubs and festivals encouraged exploration, laughter, and communal enjoyment. The unpredictable effects of high-strength or experimental brews reminded drinkers of fermentation's inherent magic, a continuity of human delight from prehistoric farmers to modern enthusiasts. Community and identity were central to craft brewing. Small breweries often rooted themselves in local culture, sourcing ingredients locally, engaging with communities, and supporting social initiatives. Beer became a medium for storytelling, connecting urban drinkers with rural heritage, historical practices, and the natural environment. It was a living expression of culture, creativity, and continuity. Education flourished alongside craft beer. Home brewing grew in popularity, and brewing schools taught both technical skills and historical context. Knowledge of yeast strains, fermentation science, and ingredient sourcing became widespread, allowing individuals to experiment at home while honoring centuries of tradition. Families and friends gathered around brewing equipment as a ritualistic and creative activity, passing down practical skills and cultural stories. The movement also embraced sustainability. Brewers experimented with renewable energy, locally sourced grains, and eco-friendly packaging. This echoed the historical balance between necessity and experimentation, adapting to environmental and social realities while maintaining cultural practices. The ancient lesson remained: fermentation is both a science and a response to circumstance. Globally, craft beer inspired innovation. Techniques, flavors, and ideas flowed across borders, creating fusion styles and hybrid brews. European traditions merged with American experimentation, Asian ingredients added new dimensions, and indigenous practices inspired creative adaptations. Beer once again became a canvas for human curiosity, blending old knowledge with new discovery. Even in a world of industrial giants, craft beer maintained its ethos of personalization, experimentation, and community. Patrons sought authenticity, connection, and flavor, choosing beer not just for sustenance but for narrative, history, and cultural resonance. Festivals, tastings, and pub gatherings mirrored ancient communal celebrations, echoing the social significance of beer through millennia. Thus, the craft beer revolution represents a culmination of history and innovation. From accidental fermentation in prehistoric fields to artisanal experimentation in urban brewpubs, beer has remained a vessel for human curiosity, creativity, and connection. The accidental drunkenness of early farmers persists in every experimental batch, every communal toast, and every festival, proving that joy, discovery, and social bonding are as integral to beer as the grains themselves. Beer, once humble and accidental, has become both art and science, tradition and innovation, a living testament to human ingenuity, patience, and the enduring magic of fermentation. In the 21st century, beer has entered the digital age. Technology, globalization, and social media have transformed how it is brewed, shared, and celebrated. Yet even in a connected world, the ancient magic of fermentation, experimentation, and accidental discovery continues to define the experience. Digital tools now assist brewers at every stage. Temperature-controlled fermenters, automated monitoring systems, and precise recipe management ensure consistency while allowing for creative experimentation. Sensors track yeast activity, sugar content, and fermentation speed, translating centuries of empirical knowledge into data-driven precision. Even small craft breweries can now combine intuition with technology, blending tradition with innovation. Social media has transformed beer culture. Instagram, TikTok, and specialized apps allow brewers to share techniques, showcase new flavors, and connect with enthusiasts worldwide. Festivals and tastings are now live-streamed, creating communities that transcend geography. A microbrewery in Belgium can interact with a homebrewer in Japan, exchanging recipes, critiques, and stories, uniting a global network of fermentation enthusiasts. Globalization has expanded ingredient diversity. Hops from New Zealand, cacao from South America, and exotic spices from Asia enrich contemporary brews. Brewers experiment with hybrid flavors, blending local traditions with international ingredients. This mirrors historical adaptation. Just as early farmers experimented with grains, modern brewers explore the possibilities of a global pantry. Apps and digital platforms also educate. Drinkers can track tasting notes, learn about beer styles, and connect with local breweries. Homebrewers access virtual classes, digital recipe libraries, and community forums. Knowledge that was once closely guarded within monastic walls or guilds is now accessible to anyone with curiosity and internet access. The centuries of accidental discovery have become a shared global heritage. Even the social aspect of drinking has evolved. Beer clubs, virtual tastings, and online festivals allow people to connect regardless of location. Communities celebrate local and global traditions alike, preserving the communal, ritualistic aspects of drinking while embracing new methods of participation. Digital tools enhance storytelling, allowing drinkers to document and share the cultural, historical, and personal significance of each brew. Yet, in all this innovation, the human element remains central. Accidental discoveries still occur, experiments that produce unexpected flavors, yeasts that behave unpredictably, or creative combinations that surprise even experienced brewers. These moments of chance mirror the earliest human interactions with fermentation, linking modern experimentation to millennia of brewing history. Local identity continues to thrive alongside global influence. Microbreweries often emphasize regional grains, water, and traditional techniques. Festivals celebrate local culture, heritage, and folklore. Beer remains a tangible link between people and place, connecting communities to the land and history in a way that complements the expansive reach of technology. Sustainability and social consciousness are increasingly central. Brewers experiment with eco-friendly practices, from solar-powered breweries to water recycling and locally sourced ingredients. This reflects an ancient principle: fermentation is both a human endeavor and a dialogue with the environment, requiring observation, care, and respect. Economic and cultural impacts persist. Craft beer drives tourism, supports local economies, and fosters innovation in food, music, and art. Beer festivals, taprooms, and breweries act as hubs for social interaction, creative collaboration, and education, echoing ancient communal gatherings where ale and mead united people. Through technology and globalization, beer continues to evolve while maintaining the essence of its long history. The accidental drunkenness of ancient farmers, the devotion of monastic brewers, the innovation of craft pioneers, all find continuity in this new era. Beer is simultaneously local and global, artisanal and scientific, traditional and experimental. In the digital age, beer remains a bridge between people, cultures, and generations. Each sip connects us to thousands of years of human curiosity, observation, and joy. Fermentation, once a humble accident, is now a globally celebrated craft, thriving in a world that values both history and innovation. Looking forward, beer continues to evolve. New ingredients, climate challenges, and cultural experimentation ensure that the story of fermentation remains dynamic, reflecting both human creativity and the enduring unpredictability of nature. Climate change has begun to influence traditional brewing practices. Variations in temperature, rainfall, and soil quality affect the growth of barley, hops, and other essential ingredients. Brewers are adapting, experimenting with drought-resistant grains, novel hop varieties, and alternative fermentables. These innovations preserve flavor and quality while responding to environmental realities. Sustainability has become central to modern brewing. Breweries increasingly adopt renewable energy, water recycling systems, and locally sourced ingredients. Packaging innovations, such as biodegradable cans, reusable kegs, and compostable materials, reduce ecological footprints. In this way, beer production honors both tradition and responsibility, reflecting a centuries-old principle. Fermentation is not just a human craft but a dialogue with the environment. Global creativity continues to flourish. Brewers experiment with exotic fruits, spices, and grains from around the world. Coffee, cacao, chili, and even botanicals like lavender and hibiscus find their way into experimental brews. These innovations merge global curiosity with local practice, creating a new era of hybrid flavors that celebrate both human ingenuity and cultural diversity. Technology also drives experimentation. precision sensors, AI-assisted recipe optimization, and automated monitoring allow brewers to test new techniques with unprecedented accuracy. Yet unpredictability remains. A wild yeast, a minor fermentation deviation, or a unique water profile can still produce unexpected magic, echoing the ancient accidents that first revealed the joy of alcohol. The social aspect of beer continues to thrive. Taprooms, festivals, and communal brewing experiences emphasize connection, storytelling, and shared discovery. Craft beer clubs, virtual tasting events, and online communities allow people worldwide to celebrate innovation while honoring centuries of tradition. The act of drinking remains a ritual of connection, whether in a local pub or across digital borders. Health and wellness trends have also influenced modern brewing. Low alcohol and alcohol-free beers, functional beverages infused with vitamins or probiotics, and gluten-free alternatives allow more people to enjoy beer while attending to personal health. These adaptations mirror historical flexibility. Brewers have always balanced cultural, social, and physical needs in their craft. Education and heritage remain central. Modern brewers study historical texts, experiment with traditional methods, and revive forgotten techniques. Ancient recipes, monastic methods, and colonial experiments are being rediscovered, adapted, and celebrated in new contexts. Each experimental batch is a bridge between past and future, linking human curiosity across millennia. Even the essence of accidental discovery persists. A miscalculated fermentation, an unexpected ingredient reaction, or a spontaneous yeast strain can produce entirely new flavors. These moments, joyful, surprising, sometimes intoxicating, remind brewers and drinkers alike that beer is not merely a product but a living story, shaped by nature, observation, and human ingenuity. As craft, technology, and tradition merge, beer's global narrative continues. Each pint carries centuries of experimentation, devotion, and celebration, from prehistoric farmers noticing bubbling grains, to monastic brewers perfecting their craft, to modern innovators pushing boundaries. Beer remains a symbol of resilience, creativity, and community. In this evolving era, the story of beer is far from complete. New generations of brewers, guided by curiosity, sustainability, and creativity, will continue to explore possibilities, honoring history while shaping the future. The accidental drunkenness of ancient farmers lives on, reminding humanity that discovery often comes from observation, patience, and a willingness to embrace the unexpected. As we conclude this journey, it becomes clear that beer is more than a beverage. It is a living testament to human ingenuity, culture, and connection, linking our ancestors to the present and inspiring future generations. From the earliest farmers who accidentally discovered fermentation in spilled grain to the modern craft brewers experimenting with exotic ingredients and technology, beer has consistently reflected humanity's curiosity, creativity, and desire for community. The story of beer begins in the fields, where grains sprouted, fermented naturally, and occasionally produced intoxicating effects. Those first moments of accidental drunkenness were not mere accidents, they were revelations. Ancient humans observed, experimented, and shared the results, forming social bonds and cultural practices around the golden liquid. This early curiosity laid the foundation for a tradition that would span continents and millennia. Monasteries preserved and refined these early techniques. Monks approached brewing with devotion and patience, carefully observing fermentation, experimenting with grains, and recording methods that ensured both quality and consistency. Beer became both nourishment and ritual, sustaining monks, pilgrims, and communities alike. These sacred beginnings highlighted beer's dual nature, a practical sustenance and a symbolic, cultural artifact. As towns and cities emerged, beer transitioned from the cloister to the marketplace. Taverns and alehouses became social hubs, facilitating trade, storytelling, and celebration. Guilds formalized techniques, apprentices learned craft and science, and regional varieties flourished. Beer became a medium through which communities expressed identity, creativity, and shared values. Accidental discoveries persisted in urban contexts, reminding people that even within structured craft, chance and curiosity could produce remarkable results. With the introduction of hops, refrigeration, and scientific understanding, beer evolved technically and culturally. Preservation, consistency, and flavor complexity improved, yet its social role remained unchanged. European empires, colonial settlers, and industrial brewers carried beer across continents, adapting to local grains, climates, and customs. Beer became simultaneously global and local, reflecting both continuity and innovation. The modern era brought industrialization, technology, and globalization. Mass production, pasteurization, and precise fermentation allowed beer to reach new audiences. Yet alongside industrial giants, craft brewers revived traditional methods, experimented with flavors, and celebrated heritage. Technology, digital apps, social media, and global collaboration expanded knowledge, connected communities, and allowed creativity to flourish. Despite precision, automation, and data-driven processes, the unpredictable magic of fermentation remained, a connection to the earliest accidental discoveries. Throughout history, beer has been more than alcohol. It nourished bodies, fostered community, inspired creativity, and carried stories. Festivals, taverns, and communal rituals ensured that beer was central to social life, education, and culture. Even accidental drunkenness became part of the collective narrative, reminding humans that discovery, joy, and error are inseparable aspects of experience. Looking to the future, beer continues to adapt. Climate change, sustainability, novel ingredients, and technological innovation challenge brewers to think creatively while honoring tradition. Each batch, whether artisanal or experimental, carries centuries of accumulated knowledge and cultural significance. The golden liquid remains a bridge between nature and humanity, past and future, science and art. Ultimately, beer is a reflection of human resilience and ingenuity. It connects farmers, monks, townspeople, explorers, industrial brewers, and modern craft enthusiasts in a shared journey of curiosity and experimentation. Every sip embodies centuries of observation, trial and error, adaptation, and celebration, a tangible link to those who first discovered that fermented grain could sustain, delight, and bring people together. In the end, the accidental drunkenness of ancient farmers is not simply a humorous anecdote, it is the seed of an enduring cultural phenomenon. It reminds us that human history is shaped not only by grand inventions and political events but also by the small, curious, and joyful acts that ripple through time. Beer, in its many forms, preserves this legacy, a living testament to human creativity, connection, and the timeless delight of discovery. So next time you lift a mug, remember, you are participating in a tradition that stretches back thousands of years, a story of chance, curiosity, and community, distilled into a golden glass of history.